So Sabrina, are we good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello and welcome everybody to what is the first hybrid event post-pandemic, if you can consider us post-pandemic. I'm Dominic. I'll be emceeing and hosting today this discussion on violence affecting young people. And the special guest we have, the expert we have, is Leah. I'll introduce her a little bit more in a minute. I'm a Peabody advisor and I was on the youth panel for the Young People's Fund. Outside of my responsibilities for Peabody, I'm a social entrepreneur that has focused around missing Black people and the disproportionate rates of missing Black people, and have built a community of 20,000 people supporting the causes of missing Black people. As someone who grew up in Newham, which is, I believe, top 10 in the most dangerous cities in London, I am especially passionate about community causes, especially youth affecting young people. I think we have mentioned that this will be recorded. The purpose of today's event, if we jump, and the agenda is that we are going to, if I just move this, we are going to have a roundtable discussion and discuss the root causes and solutions around violence affecting young people. And we also have an opportunity for questions and answers to help your organization, to help everybody make great applications and to really pursue and champion the causes. We want to further understand the causes affecting young people and how to generate effective responses. And we want to improve the support offered by Peabody and the partners. We want to know if the people applying for grants, if you guys are applying for grants, what you need, what challenges you're facing to help really design better responses and to answer any questions on the Young People's Fund. So without further ado, we're going to jump to Leah. Leah is a specialist in the area tackling violence affecting young people and children. She has worked for over 15 years in this statutory and non-statutory organizations. And throughout this time, she's been engaged with multiple different stakeholders and hyper-local communities to affect change and have an extreme positive impact. So Leah, please take it away.
Thank you so much, what a wonderful introduction. Thank you. So I'm going to be sharing the root causes of violence affecting young people, and as introduced, I'm Leah Uwaibi.
Sorry to interrupt, Leah. Can you speak a little louder? It's a bit tricky.
Okay, no problem. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
thank you.
I'm quite the talker, so if you want me loud, that's fine. I'll project my voice. Is that everything good now? Okay,
yeah, thank you.
Fab. So this presentation does come with a health warning. We will be looking at the root causes, and some people, vape, so that's the acronym for violence affecting young people, is quite close to home. It's quite a personal subject, it's quite hard hitting, and there will be a graphic image of a deceased body. So I just wanted to give that health warning before I start this presentation. Okay, let's kick off. So just to give a brief introduction, the topic of vape is huge. It's very complex and it's very broad. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to base it on my research. So it's on a systematic review that I did this year, and it was focusing on the original sampling across YOIs, so that's Youth Offending Institutes, and juvenile prisons in the USA, and a residential home. So original sampling is basically you get a certain amount of young offenders in a prison, and then you conduct research based on the question. So my question was ACEs, which is the acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and the influence this has on young people becoming youth offenders. I do want to say very early on in this presentation, I'm not going to be covering VAG, which is violence against women and girls, and committal offences of sexual offences, and also disability, just because this was not a prominent feature of the research, because VAG is under-researched, women are under-researched because their males are predominantly in prison opposed to females. And it also needs a dedicated focus, so it would need a dedicated systematic review carried out. However, I'm happy afterwards to answer any questions. I have got a lot of frontline experience in all of those areas, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, any gaps that I've identified at the end. Thank you. So just a little bit about me. This is my background. As you can see, my career began in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, so that's RBKC. I was born and bred in Ladbroke Grove. And here you can see that we went into an employee-led mutuals when the youth services were cut. I've got lots of experience and a background in youth work, I was a lead for learning difficulties, disabilities and mental health. I did a lot of stuff around NEET work and managing high-profile projects to reduce the NEET cohort in the borough. I was seconded to the yacht and did a lot of work with various different statutory and non-statutory agencies to reduce youth violence. And I did a lot of work around serious youth violence, and I was the women's lead with that, and homelessness also. As you can see, I've put the Grenfell Tower there because I work directly with survivors of the Grenfell Tower and the young people that were directly and adversely impacted. And actually at this point, this was the kind of the trigger, if you like, where I thought, okay, I'm using more therapeutic approaches and I need to go back and upskill myself. And that's when I did my MA in social work. And you have Greenwich and Bexley Community Hospice here where I did my placement. I've also led and managed youth services in the Southeast, and those are all the youth offending institutions there, and the Medway Secure Training Centre. Oh, let me not forget HAYN, because I know I can see Sarah's looking at me. So I'm currently working for HAYN. I'm the project manager looking at violence affecting young people. And that is a partnership with the Violence Reduction Unit at the Mayor's Office. Thank you. So now just quickly, I want you to take about 60 seconds for you to just think about, what do you think the root causes of vape are? Most of you are online, so you can just jot this down on your piece of paper. There's no right or wrong answers. This could be personal, this could be lived experience, this could be based on the experiences that you've had, your direct frontline work with young people or work in the past if you're more at kind of management or senior level. And even at a strategical management and senior level, there's a certain understanding that you may have. So if you just jot that down now in your time. And the reason I'm asking you to do this is because I want you to go back to this at the end of the presentation as a point of reference for reflective practice. Okay. So now that you've looked at your personal beliefs about what you think the root causes are, we're going to get into that now, about what I think the root causes are based on my research. So when I see this image, and I've chosen to put this here, this is the tip of the iceberg. And I think when it comes to vape, this is what we see. We see the knife crime, we see, you know, the violence, we see the really negative portrayal in the media, we see the uprise in, you know, violence affecting young people, but seldom do we see the root causes. Do we see the deprivation? Do we see the real causes that are creating the tip of the iceberg? And actually, the real part of the iceberg is underwater and we only see the tip. So this is a really thought-provoking image that I wanted to kind of leave you with as we're working through the root causes. Little food for thought. So what are ACEs? For those of you that don't know, the origins of adverse childhood experiences derived from a study in 1995 by the Centers for Disease Control. So they carried out a study with people who were obese, and they were looking at why they weren't losing the weight. And as the research was underway, they realized that the cohort of people that they used for the research had experienced trauma during childhood, and that was the reason why they couldn't lose the weight. As a result of that, as time has gone on in connection to vape, we have criminologists, Baglivio and Fox et al., who have built upon this work, and they have said, okay, well, trauma leads to adverse health outcomes. So let's look at these ACEs and see if it affects or impacts on young people becoming youth offenders. And so they've done that, and we have 10 typologies of abuse, which is in this lovely diagram that I've put here. I hope you can all see it. We've got abuse, which is physical, emotional, and sexual. We've got neglect, which is physical and emotional. We've got household dysfunction, although I really don't like the word dysfunction, but it's there. Mental illness, incarceration of a parent, and then domestic abuse. We've got substance misuse and divorce. So this work started to build on and look at the fact that, okay, young people who commit offences, most of them have been affected by some sort of trauma as a child. So the research showed that 90% of offenders across all of the institutions that I was looking at in both the USA and the UK had experienced ACEs. So that's almost the entire population. And also the odds of juveniles offending who had been impacted or had directly been experienced ACEs, it increased the odds of them offending by more than 200%. So it's huge. And ACEs, it's really important to have a background and understand, get an in-depth understanding of ACEs. I can't go through everything today because I have a short amount of time, but this is the reason why we've moved towards more of a public health approach. And you see in Scotland and Wales, they've really used ACEs and a trauma-informed approach to move towards the public health approach that we are adopting in the Violence Reduction Unit currently. So then this leads me to looking at life through a lens. Beliefs determine what you see. And the whole move and shift towards the public health approach and the trauma-informed approach is that we look at the life of these young people who are affected by vape through the lens of trauma. And when we start to look at the lives of these young people who are affected by vape through trauma, we can begin to understand their behaviours and not see them as a perpetrator, but actually as a victim. So there's an understanding and a whole school of thought that our psychosocial views frame our world. So that's your views, that's your belief systems, that's your cultural influences, your environment, your upbringing. That is what shapes how you see the world. So if young people have experienced adverse childhood experiences and grown up in extreme levels of, deprivation, they are going to see the world through that lens. And part of our work is to help them, to give them different experiences and opportunities and to see things slightly different through, trauma-informed approaches, through understanding that. When I carried out my first part of research, where I interviewed gang members across the West London and North West London area, they said to me that they are living in a war zone. And this really gave me a lot to reflect on, because as we go to take our children to school, as we make our way to work, we're living in a parallel universe alongside these young people who are experiencing vape. We are living our normal lives going to and from, and they are living in a war zone. So they are essentially living life through the lens of a war zone. So it's really important for us to shift our mindset and the way that we see, so that we can also see the way that young people see and live their lives through a similar lens. So based on my findings, there was a thematic map that I drew up. And this, again, is only based on my research. I know there's a lot more kind of, themes that would come out. It's a very broad subject. In my current work, I have over 25 themes. So this is based on the research, which whittles it down to 7. So based on the question, looking at ACEs increasing the risk of young people becoming offenders, we have themes that came out of this, which was that they commit serious violent crime, there's neuropsychological effects, post-traumatic stress disorder, community deprivation, and the socio-economic impact, mental health and psychopathy, and offenders as children in protective services, and that's in America, but here we call it LAC, looked after children. So I did mention earlier, let's jump in the gun a bit, but we now need to look at the victim versus perpetrator theory, because the social learning theory by Bandura teaches us that, young people and children, they mirror learned behavior. So now let's look at this a little bit more deeply. So the young people show patterns of learned behavior through direct experience of observing others. So the victim versus perpetrator overlap, there's an overlap with offenders. So they imitate behavior. So for example, sexual, violent and emotional abuse. So an example of this is when I was working in the Medway Secure Training Centre, and we had a young person there who I think was about 11, who had committed various sexual offences, but he had been sexually abused by his father and uncle throughout the age of 2 and upwards. So he was mirroring that behaviour, he was learning that behaviour. Children and adolescents in particular, they go to school, they go to nursery and they learn, but the main way they learn is through their parents, it's at home. And that's the idea of the social learning theory, that you learn through environment and you learn through the people around you. So I want to ask you the question, if these young people have grown up with ACEs or grown up with, you know, certain examples that they've imitated, are they then the victim or the perpetrator? So they've witnessed this as a victim and they thereby learn these behaviors through experiencing the abuse themselves. So essentially the victim becomes the perpetrator. Interestingly, in the research that I carried out to support this, the strongest predictor of serious violent crime among the ACEs was an incarcerated household member and domestic abuse inflicted on a mother. And that more than doubled the odds of the young person becoming an offender. Isn't that fascinating? That the ACEs that involved physical kind of contact, physical abuse, that led to them then mimicking that behavior, imitating it and becoming violent offenders. Because in a secure training center or in a youth offending institute, you know, young people are in there for various different crimes. There could be one young person that commits a burglary, but then one young person that commits a burglary and then uses a bladed article and ends up killing a child or a family in the household. So the nature of the violence, you know, is different. So I just want to move on to the grief, bereavement and trauma. I think, you know, in terms of my life's work, I think this and the neuro sort of physical aspect of things, I think is really important for us as practitioners to understand. So I'm going to take my time a little bit with this one. So 80.5% of gang members had someone close to them die. I can't see the side of hair, but and grief and bereavement and trauma is suffered because of the committal. Okay, thank you. 80.5% of gang members had someone close to them die, and grief, bereavement and trauma is suffered because of the committal of the serious violent crime and the trauma of incarceration. So the area of violent death, for example, murder, it's sudden, it's unexpected and caused by intentional power. So it's that, you know, it's also the type of death that's experienced, especially by those in gang members, and that turns into complicated grief. They're unable to move past the grief, they cannot process it, and there's an ability to move through the stages of grief. So if you're familiar with the Kubler-Ross theory of the stages of grief, we all move through stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression and acceptance. And where you get complicated grief is when a person cannot move through those stages as they normally would. So the idea is that after 1 year, you should start to move through those stages and accept the grief. But in complicated grief, they hold on to and refuse to accept the loss, and they become unable to heal. So research shows that I carried out that complicated grief in gang members, especially, those bereaved by violent death was 12.5% to 78%. So that's huge. So we have young people walking around with hurt, undiagnosed mental health, confusion, lack of resources, lack of diagnosis, and lack of support. So when you see a young person, maybe in black, completely covered up, it's sometimes just an outward pouring of the grief and the turmoil that they feel internally. So now moving on to PTSD, that usually happens after the complicated grief and unresolved trauma. So in the research that I carried out, 30% of youth in the justice system met the criteria for PTSD, and the untreated exposure to violent communities resulted in PTSD. So overall, ACEs increased mental health symptoms, and research showed that young people with multiple ACEs have more psychological and mental health disorders. So now moving on to the neuropsychological effects. I thought about leaving this out, but I thought it's really important for us to understand, and hopefully after this talk, I would urge you to go and do some further research around this, because it can be really groundbreaking in understanding the deeper rooted core issues of vape, and also to help you grow as a practitioner and to help your practitioners grow. So ACEs affect the developmental functioning of adolescents, such as chromosome damage and functional changes to the developing brain. So there's a body of medical research, and based on my placement, so looking at grief, bereavement and trauma at end of life palliative care service, and doing my personal research to look at the links, I found in research that children who experience ACEs have a higher risk of developing mental health diagnosis. So when you look at something like fetal alcohol syndrome, you see that that's caused by a mother who's drinking or substance misuse while pregnant, and then that later will lead to things like global delay in adolescence, and that is a result of the parents suffering from ACEs, and it's just this perpetuating cycle. So it's really important to understand that. And also, stressful events caused by ACEs lead to heightened neural states, and there's physical side effects to the brain. So it causes the brain to leak adrenal steroids, amino acids, and other stress managing chemicals, which lead to elastic overload and release stress managing chemicals. And this happens over time. So there's a release of these chemicals in the brain over time because it's trying to manage this continuous chronic stress as a child up until the teen years. So examples of this kind of stress would be ongoing child abuse and things like CCE, so child criminal exploitation, child sexual exploitation. County lines would all fall into this. They're all, child protection issues, and they're all classed as child abuse now. And another interesting thing that I want to leave you with is that stress causes inflammation. And actually, inflammation is the basis of all disease. So it'd be really interesting, I don't know if anybody carries out research to perhaps look at this and look at the young people in gangs and see, look at the health outcomes, the adverse health outcomes. But unfortunately, not many of them are living past the years of 15, 14, 20, 25. And so we can't always get a true grasp of this research, but I believe if we could, we would see that young people are dying quite young because of the adverse health outcomes due to the neuropsychological effects. And I just wanted to leave you with this quote, because avoidance of pain is the biggest defense mechanism. And we see young people trying to avoid the pain of their deprivation in their communities, the pain of being with, a mother who can't afford to put food on the table, the pain of perhaps not having a role model or their friend being murdered, last week or last year or last month. And so in an attempt to avoid that pain, they inflict the pain onto others. So moving on to community deprivation. Are we okay for time? I've put the title here, Survival of the Fittest, because in my research carried out, that is literally what the young people say. This is survival of the fittest and only the strong survive. So community disadvantage can affect ACE exposure. So the social disorganization theory describes the collapse of community control, the inability to realize common values in disadvantaged neighborhoods, which lead to criminal values replacing societal norms. So that's where we see the formation of gangs, drug dealing, and these are all being used as a way of survival. And then that leads to that lack of trust in the police, the local authority, and they start to build their own kind of, almost like building their own law enforcement. And I don't know if you've ever worked closely with gangs or worked closely with vape young people in kind of large estates. They literally do have their own almost like law enforcement. They have the elders, that structure. You don't go to the police. So it's understanding that that social disorganization is part of that. So the social disorganization theory claims that vape was not caused at an individual level, but a normal response to abnormal social conditions. So I'm going to repeat that. So social disorganization claims that it was not caused at an individual level, but a normal response to an abnormal social condition. Isn't that amazing? So it is displayed in the unrestricted freedom for young people that are experiencing vape to express anger and need. And it often results in violent behavior, but I like to call this a cry for help. So now we look at the broken society. This ideology has been exacerbated by inequality. We've seen this in advance through these neoliberal ideologies, from conservative governments over time. And this has resulted in cuts to public services. A lot of the youth services we see being cut, a lot of these detrimental services that these young people need to engage them and keep them off the streets. So these cuts to public services and welfare could potentially be what's leading to this social disorganization. So if we look at the creation of housing estates and / projects, because this work was carried out in the UK and the US, we see racial / class inequalities, which form welfare ghettos. And this is the reality of young people living their everyday lives. Criminality and violence have deep-rooted structural issues such as inequality, poverty, injustice, and that's produced by the cuts and the austerity. And the creation of these ghettos and estates have contributed to the increase in violence and further marginalization and the dehumanization of these communities. So then I ask you the question, are young people then just a product of their environment? And there's statistics to support this, which show that 1/4 of the poorest children live in 10% of the most deprived local authorities. So I'll take a quote from some of the research, and it said, geographical ghettos of poverty are trapping a generation of people and their children. So deprivation, social inequality create social disorganization, and they propel young people into a life of crime because of unfair systems and inequality. So now just quickly, I'm not going to go into this, but I'd urge you to look at this in your own time. But when you look at the PCS, the personal, cultural and social model, it looks at discrimination that people face amongst different layers. So you've got the structural, the cultural and the personal, and it's the ideology that discrimination is not an individual issue, but it's also present at the cultural, social structures and networks, and intersectionality comes into that. I wish I had time to get into intersectionality, but I just don't. But I'll quickly illustrate that if you have a young person who's she's maybe gay and she's Black and she's female, she will encounter, and then maybe she's from a deprived neighborhood, she would encounter discrimination, unlike another young person who's maybe living on the estate, who's maybe not, who's not gay or not Black. So it's looking at the different structures and the different layers of discrimination within that. And it's a quick kind of illustration of intersectionality. So now I ask you, are we part of the problem? And this is generically, I'm not singling you out, but are we part of the problem as practitioners? Because we have to look at ourselves. Do you have anti-oppressive practice in your teams? Do you have anti-discriminatory practice within your teams? Are you looking at things like unconscious bias? Are you looking at intersectionality? Are you looking at personal values? Are you looking at cultural beliefs? Because PAYN defines discrimination as a means of identifying individuals and groups with certain characteristics and treating them less well than people or groups with conventionally valued characteristics. So as I said earlier, your psychosocial views will frame how you see the world. So that's based on your beliefs, your upbringings, and you could have certain discriminatory outlooks or certain behaviors or feelings towards young people with vape. So it's really about looking at that in a deeper way and looking at what that means for you as a practitioner and what that means for your team and your wider networks. So now looking at effective responses. So this is what I like to call the prevention is cure approach. So now you see that there's a shift towards the public health approach, which I do welcome, and I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. We're moving towards a public health approach, which is it's an early intervention response, and this is one of the main reasons for the formation of the Violence Reduction Unit where I sit currently. So the response is looking at the root causes, and vape is actually a worldwide issue. It's not a UK issue, it's a worldwide issue, it's an epidemic. 200,000 homicides occur among young people aged 10 to 29 years old every year, which is 42% of total homicides globally each year. Homicide is the 4th leading cause of death in people aged 10 to 29 years, and 84% of these are male. So the whole idea of a public health approach and, an epidemic is that you're looking at a disease that can be prevented. So like diseases have symptoms, they have causes, they have treatments. In looking at vape as potentially a disease, then we're able to look at the root causes, we're able to look at treatment, we're able to look at cure, we're able to look at symptoms and signs, early signs to prevent it. So the good news is it is preventable. So the second thing is that we need to work more towards therapeutic approaches. So that deals with a lot of the kind of the mental health, the trauma that young people are experiencing, the victim versus perpetrator, so not looking at them as perpetrators, you know, looking at more kind of restorative justice, you know, and looking at more treatment and looking at more therapeutic approaches rather than, you know, this very kind of strict way of kind of just sentencing young people and locking them up and throwing away the key. We need to look at the root causes and treat that through therapy. And also collaborative and collective working, and this is a part of the role why I've been employed, is this collective impact way of working. And so I've worked in both non-governmental, like non-statutory and statutory, and I'm trained in both. And I can tell you that a lot of the time they work in isolation. So it's about working collaboratively towards a greater cause and looking at vape, and that we need to work collectively to, you know, impact and reduce this violence. So I'm not going to go, but yeah, basically trauma-informed practice and projects. So we need to create more opportunity for communities. We need to give communities back their power. And we need to look at young people through their lens. So we need to look at county lines, CCE, CSE through the lens of a trauma-informed approach. And also, I just want to say here, we need to create more advantage. So we're kind of bridging the gap, because inequality is a huge root cause. We need to have more opportunities for young peoples in the communities. We need to empower communities to give them the resources and tools to build up their communities and not break them down. So essentially, we need to give communities their power back so we can get our young people back. And just reflections on the process. I don't have much time, but I'm not going to go through this, but I would really urge you to have reflective supervision in your teams, you know, in your companies. It's really important because we need to become reflective practitioners. You know, I've worked on the front line. There's a lot of frontline practitioners who are dealing with, you know, young people being murdered, young people being stabbed in front of them, the stories, the tales that young people have, they share in that trauma. And so it's really important to have that reflective supervision practice. If you want, you know, any advice around this or any support, please do reach out to myself or Sarah or Sabrina, and I can definitely support more with that. I think it's really important moving forward. And I'm going to leave you with this by the famous Maya Angelou poet. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So as we go out there and, you know, you apply for this funding, you work with these young people, let's remember that they will not forget how we made them feel in our practice. Thank you very much for listening.
I want to thank you, Leah. I hope everybody was taking as many notes as I was taking. It was very, very insightful. What we're going to do now is we have some time allocated to answer some questions. So we have 5 questions that we'd like to ask you for you to answer. You can do this on paper form or from your chair. And so, okay. So I think there has been a slight change of schedule. So you said we're going to move to the facilitating. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to have a round table.